We've got an exciting next guest. I want to welcome to the stage Bridgewater Associates and Dalio Family Office founder and mentor, Ray Dalio. Ray, welcome. All right, Ray, so I know you see the world in bigger cycles than this, but I want to ask you first about the news cycle we've all lived through in just the past couple of days. We had President Trump threatening big tariffs on European countries over Greenland last night. He dropped that tariff threat despite the fact that the deal that we hear has been preliminarily agreed does not include the U.S. owning Greenland, which he said, was the terms that he needed. There's been a lot of commentary that this is another case of the markets constraining this president. There was market pressure, and he reacted to it. Do you see it that way, this narrative of, taco, as people say, Trump always chickens out? Or how do you see what we just saw over Greenland in terms of the markets and Trump in the last few days?
Well, very simply, there's a monetary order that has to do with what is money. That can be the opposite of a trade war, can be a capital war. So you have to understand the mechanics of the possible capital war. And so we got to the point where there was going to be a trade war move and a possible military move. Just brings us to the geopolitical part and how they're connected, okay? And if there would have been a trade war move, then there would have been a capital war reaction. We should talk about the recognition that the opposite side of a trade war, a trade deficit, and so on, is capital. And there's not been enough discussion of what is going on with capital or how you can have a capital war. But what happened in his speech is that there was a stepping back from both that trade war that would have provoked both a trade response and a capital response that is very much market impacting. And so that's the nature of what happened. That step back, so you can see it in the market action. You could see as that approached, what you saw was stocks and bonds going down, gold going up, okay? Gold is being held. Don't think of gold as a metal that there's a speculative market in. Think about it as a money that central banks treat as a money, yet it's their second largest reserve currency is gold, and it becomes an alternative to fiat monies, and it becomes an alternative. And so this trade war and this monetary order and this international geopolitical order are coming together with a classic example of that case and that moment. Now, they're part of the bigger arc that we're talking about, right? That was today's a moment, right? But you have to step back from that, and you have to see how the monetary orders transpire, how the geopolitical orders transpire, because the monetary order is weakening and breaking down. The monetary order is changing. The geopolitical order is changing. The domestic political order is changing. And those are the factors, and how they're changing are driving what we're seeing.
Ray, you said we're not talking enough about the possibility of a capital war, so let's talk about it. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has downplayed this week, the idea that countries are going to be selling U.S. assets or weaponizing their ownership of U.S. debt. It sounds like you're not as dismissive of the possibility. Talk about how you see a capital war potentially shaping up and how the ramifications are different than a trade war.
Well, you can see what's happening. You can see, for example, what are central banks doing with their reserves, okay? And you can see that they're lessening the mix on fiat currency and dollars and acquiring gold, okay? Now you can understand why that exists. That exists for a few reasons, okay? Those few reasons are, first of all, one man's debts are another man's assets. So when they're holding these as a money, then that means that they're looking at, first, What is the supply and the demand and the value of that money? What is the real return that I'm going to get on that money? So there is a supply-demand issue, and everybody recognizes that. Secretary Bessent himself referred to the importance of getting that deficit down to 3% of GDP. So there's a supply-demand money problem. But as throughout history, and certainly now, there is also the issue of politics and geopolitics. And when I'm referring to the issue of geopolitics, there are worries on both sides about that relationship. There's a worry of the holders of that it can be weaponized, that maybe they don't get their money. If you look at history in Japan prior to World War II, the holders of those bonds, Japanese holders, did not receive their money, just like Russia did not receive their money, and so on. And so there's a sense that it might be a prudent thing to diversify, and fiat currencies, which basically reflect those countries' indebtedness. When you hold a currency, you're holding a debt instrument. And when in many countries, the euro has a problem, Japan has a problem, China has a problem in terms of those fiat currencies being debt instruments. So you're seeing more of that happen. So this is understandable. It would be not understandable if it didn't occur.
It's difficult to listen to what you're saying now and to read your work and not feel a little bit more trepidation about the direction of the economy than otherwise. I've heard at a lot of panels here at Davos. There's quite a bit of enthusiasm among some. I want to take it back to the stock market on that point for a second.
Can we go to the five main forces?
Well, I want to hear about your five main forces, but first I want to hear about your reaction to if you, I don't run a hedge fund, and it's a good thing I don't, but if you had told me a year ago, okay, you can see the future, there's going to be this level of tariff conflict, there's going to be this level of geopolitical conflict, and these are forces that you've written about extensively, you're going to have this assault on central bank independence, here are going to be the things happening in the news, I would have said sell, the markets are going to be melting down, and actually what we've seen is S&P 500 is up, I think 13% over Trump's first year in office. The reality that you were just describing, does it feel to you that it's out of step with where the markets are right now?
No, not at all. It's, I think my job here, my responsibility, my goal is to try to teach people about the cause-effect mechanics of how things work. And a lesson that I learned, August 15th, 1971, I had just graduated from college, and I was about to go to graduate school, and I had followed the markets for a long time, and I was clerking on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, in other words, a clerk. And on Sunday night, August 15th, President Nixon says the United States is, he didn't say it this way, that the United States is going to default on its obligation to give gold in exchange for money. There was the idea that they had built up a lot of debt is money, they built up a lot. There was too much out there for them to back it up, and so they broke down money, and that was the beginning of the breakdown of the monetary system that started in 1944. And so I went on the floor of the stock exchange, and much like you would think that, boy, that's a big deal. We're ending money as we know it. I thought that, and I found the stock market was up the most in more than a decade. And I found that I went back in history, and I found that the exact same thing happened in March 1933 when Roosevelt got on the radio and did the exact same thing. He said, "You're not going to get your gold at that money. We're going to, and they were going to flood the market, the banking system. We had bank holiday, but no worry, you're going to be able to get your money." Okay, and I learned that when we look at the prices of things through the lens of the value of money, they go up. Okay, because the value of money goes down. When the value of money goes down, it goes up. So very much, it's very interesting to me when you see like people looking at things. Think about it that the currency that you're looking through, I'm sure there are a bunch of different currencies and countries that you're in. If you were in Switzerland and you're looking at the returns of American stocks and bonds, it would look very different than if you were an American looking through a dollar lens and so on because of the magnitudes of movements. So, for example, last year, American markets significantly underperformed foreign markets, and people don't quite realize that. And the best asset class, in a sense, was gold, but think of that as being the money. So, in answer to your question, okay, I've learned, that was a lesson I learned, that if there's a depreciation in the value of money, it makes everything look like it's going up and so on. And there's also a stimulation that comes from that.
You've obviously learned a lot. You've taught a lot to many of us over the years. You talked about the 5 forces you see shaping the world. Can you talk a bit about the intersection that you've seen this week? Obviously, your forces: debt, internal conflicts, external conflict, forces of nature, technology. A lot of talk about AI. How are those forces converging right now?
Thank you for asking the question. What I find is that, like, every day there's some news item, and everybody's paying attention to the news, and they don't pay attention to the arc and the cause-effect relationship. And it's like every day they're surprised. And they're surprised because they've gotten used to an old world order that is changed, okay? And they don't think, how has that order changed? But all these orders have changed. So, okay, there's a monetary order in a way that you create money, and then you create debt. Debt is a promise to deliver money, and as debt rises relative to one's income, and debt service payments rise relative to one's income, as is happening for the governments, then that squeezes out spending. If your income, just like for you, the governments are the same as you, they're the same as companies. When that debt service rises, it squeezes out income. The difference is that the government can print the money. That's the main difference, okay? So, and so we are seeing that happen. Second influence on the money, the way the machine works, is there's a supply and a demand, okay? So when you run a deficit, you sell bonds or you sell the debt. And then the holder of that debt is holding an asset. And so they look at what is the return and the safety of that asset. And so when we look at central banks, and we just talked about that, and central banks, they say, how safe is that asset and so on. We are going through that dynamic. It's important to understand that dynamic. That force is interrelated to the other forces, which the other force is a domestic, a political force. And because economics has such an effect on economy, and when you have very large wealth and values differences, okay, and you get to the point where they're irreconcilable differences, you have a conflicts and not a belief in the system. And you have the breaking down of democracies. In other words, the rules, because it's not a matter of simply, I'm going to take a vote and I'm going to be happy with the vote and I'm going to go along with the vote and so on. We saw in the 30s 4 democracies choose to be autocracies, and that. Plato wrote about it in the Republic, I think that was like 380 BC, about the nature of the dynamic and so on. And so it has very big implications in terms of right now, the conflict of the left and the right and so on, and that reflects on markets, it reflects on everything else. The third force is the geopolitical force, okay? So there's a world order, okay? World order comes after there's a war, and then who gets to set the rules? The United States got to set the rules because it was a dominant world power. It created a world order in which it replicated Americans' view of governance. So it created this multilateral world order with organizations that were supposed to take votes, the United Nations, the World Court, the World Bank, the world this is and that, okay, multilateral. It was only could exist if it's consistent with the power to influence. Whenever there's a system, a legal system, who has the power? Because if you don't have the power to influence. Now, if you have the system operating at odds with what the American want to do, and the Americans have the system, you have a breakdown of that order. So we're having a breakdown of that order. It's naive to believe that we're going to go back with the storytelling. It's like the tooth fairy or Santa Claus, believing in Santa Claus. It is naive. You take through history, and what you have is power. Power rules, okay, and self-interest is predominant, and so on. And that's the third force. The fourth force is that there is acts of nature. Throughout history, droughts, floods, and pandemics have killed more people than wars and toppled more citizens. Orators than anything else. And then the fifth force is technology. Man's inventiveness of new technologies and their effect on productivity and so on. And we have the greatest, maybe the greatest ever, change in technology. Certainly, it's an industrial revolutionary order of magnitude change in technology. And it's the interactions of those. So whoever wins the technology war will win the military, geopolitical war. They're going to win the economic war. And so if you follow the arcs of these things, they are interrelated in ways that have repeated throughout history. So if you look at these cycles throughout history, you get classic that dynamic.
Right. Not only was that a tour de force, you've also helped set up our next discussion. We're going to be talking about technology going forward. Thank you so much for your time. That's unfortunately all the time we have.